And while this man was living in Caesar's home, in his retirement, he met a very beautiful relative of Caesar by the name of Claudia Popula, fell in love with her and wooed and won her hand in marriage. Now after his marriage, this man began to look around for something to do. You see, most of his life had been spent amidst a clash of arms. And this quiet, sedentary life of retirement didn't agree with him very well. He was restless.
You're listening to Amazing Facts speaker Joe Cruz describe one of the most significant characters in human history. Today, he introduces a two-part series which could well change your life. Stay tuned for the crusade topic, the saddest story in the Bible.
Today, I want to point you to the most pathetic story in all the Bible. It's a story of a man who was born a slave, yet rose to the pinnacle of success and finally became the most abject failure of any man in human history. This man was really born in the Roman Empire as the lowest of slaves. Now, back in those days, it was customary for slaves to be mustered automatically right into the armed forces of the legions of Rome. Now you can imagine there was not much loyalty among this particular class of individuals. But the man I'm talking about was a very brave man and a very ambitious man as well. And he rose just as high as it was possible for a man to go as a slave in the legions of Rome. In fact, this man's bravery and his mighty deeds of heroism were carried far and near until finally they came to the ears of Caesar himself. And in recognition of what this man was doing for the empire and the contribution he was making to the kingdom, Caesar actually changed his status and made him a free man so that he could go higher as an officer in the armies of Rome. This man became one of the most loyal servants of the emperor. In fact, if the king sent him out there to fight a battle, he would bravely lead the army out there and win the battle. For example, when he was sent over to fight against Sicily, he went out and won that battle and then came back to lay the prize at the feet of his master. Finally, after a very distinguished military career, this man retired from the armed forces and went back to Rome amidst the grateful applause of the people he had served. And there, again, in recognition of what he had done for the kingdom, Caesar actually invited him into his own household to live out his years of retirement there as a member of the royal family. And while this man was living in Caesar's home, in his retirement, he met a very beautiful relative of Caesar by the name of Claudia Popula, fell in love with her and wooed and won her hand in marriage. Now after his marriage, this man began to look around for something to do. You see, most of his life had been spent amidst a clash of arms. And this quiet, sedentary life of retirement didn't agree with him very well. He was restless. He wanted something to do. Now, at that time, there was just one great trouble spot in the Roman Empire, and that was Palestine. It was a seething, sizzling, boiling pot of sedition and unrest. So this man submitted his request to Caesar that he might be appointed as the governor of that province. And after due consideration, that request was granted. And very soon afterward, this man moved his family from Rome over to Jerusalem. Now, in the Bible, of course, this man's name is called Pontius Pilate. He was a fierce, dogmatic individual. He was a corrupt man also. And he hated the Jews with a purple passion. You know, sometimes just for the fun of it, he would dress his soldiers up as Hebrew worshipers, and they would go right into the sacred assemblies with the Jews themselves. And when everybody was gathered together, they would whip out their weapons and beat the poor Jews unmercifully. Now, this kind of thing went on, getting more severe, and the tension kept mounting and mounting and getting worse until finally the whole thing seemed to come to a climax and the incident over the aqueduct. You see, Pilate had insisted that the Jews help pay for this public project out of their temple treasury, and they refused to do so. And so Pilate gathered a group of soldiers and marched down there, determined that he would forcibly extract the money from the treasury. But the Jews heard about this, and so they massed themselves out in front of the temple and prevented him from carrying out his plot. Now later on, the Jews learned that 16 men had been responsible for foiling their plan. And so soon a messenger came running to tell Pilate that all 16 of those men were worshiping together down in the temple area. So he gathered a contingency of soldiers and marched down there and slaughtered those men right there before their altars. Their blood mingled with that of their sacrifice. You'll find that story, by the way, in Luke chapter 13. And so this situation kept on deteriorating, getting worse and worse. One protest committee after another went to Pilate, trying to intercede with him, to get him to back off a little bit on the pressure he was putting upon the Jews. But this man who had never been defeated in all his life would have nothing to do with it. Absolutely nothing. In fact, he told them that they would do what they were told to do, or else there would be plenty of trouble. Now, friends, this was the situation when Pilate came face to face with Jesus of Nazareth. I think you know the circumstances of that event. Jesus had gone out, you remember, on that Thursday night with his disciples. He wanted them to pray with him out there on that mountain and in that garden during that long night, because he needed them at that time. But you know, the flesh was weak, and the Bible says that they slumbered and slept there. And then very early in the morning, there came this mob of people with their swords and their staves, determined that they were going to capture Jesus and put him to death. And his disciples fled. They left him there. And they dragged Jesus on into the judgment hall. Now, this was very, very early in the morning, friends. But these Jews were so determined to kill Jesus that they were even willing to defy the law. You see, it was illegal for anybody to be tried in the darkness of the night. It was still night. And so here they went now, taking Jesus to bring him before the authorities there and get him sentenced to death. You see, they couldn't put a man to death. There was no way for these religious authorities to actually execute any kind of capital punishment upon anybody. That had to come from Rome. And the stamp and seal, at least of the government, had to be behind any kind of capital punishment. And they knew that. But they were determined to do it. They hated this man more than anything else. He was a competitor with the people for their favor. And so here they went now, dragging him in there in the darkness of the night, actually determined they would get some sort of a sentence against him so they could go ahead and put him to death. But you know, friends, when they came there into Pilate's judgment hall, he was still back sleeping in his chambers. It was too early in the morning for him to ever be about his official duties. But these leaders of the Jews were so angry, and they were so determined to get rid of Jesus, their personal enemy, that they even dared to send a messenger back there to arouse the sleeping governor out of his own chambers. Now, I have tried to imagine the disposition of that governor on that morning. I mean, here were these people that he despised, and here they were coming back and daring to disturb him out of his sleep. I can imagine that as he dressed himself to go out there, his face was contorted with fury, his fists were clenched, and he was determined to get out there and get this business over with as quickly as possible so that he could get back to his sleep again. And then I have tried to imagine the impact of that initial confrontation as he came in there and took his seat at that bench and looked over into the face of that prisoner standing before him. My friends, Pilate had never in his life seen such purity, such holy innocence upon the face of anybody. And he must have stood there almost transfixed as he looked over into the face of that accused man, his face slowly relaxing, his fist slowly unclenching. And then he stood looking at that man before him. And my friends, I believe right then, at that moment, the Spirit of God began to work on the heart of that tyrant governor. I believe some strange new feelings began to stir in his heart, maybe that he had never felt before. He knew immediately and instinctively that this man was innocent. He could see through that whole thinly disguised plot of the Jews to get rid of one of their personal enemies. And he could see the very stamp of heaven on the face of that man. It was so open, it was so obvious. He was not guilty at all. This was a setup. This was a plot. He saw all of that. Now, friends, don't misunderstand me today. Pilate was not a good man. He was not a just man. He was not even an honest judge, and he had sent many an innocent man to their death, no doubt about that. But somehow on this occasion there was a strange and mysterious constraint upon him. There was a new spirit struggling within him as he looked at that man, and I believe, of course, that that was the Spirit of God. And he was convicted that somehow, by some means, he must release this man. He must have nothing to do with this man. And so there began within him a tremendous turmoil and battle that I'd like to follow with you. As we take note of the 5 steps Pilate took in his downward course of self-condemnation and destruction. And I would like to remind you today that every single one of us can take those same steps if we allow ourselves to do it. And I want us to recognize what Pilate did, and to understand that you and I also are faced with some very similar decisions that he had to make that day. And the question is, what are we going to do about it? Now, the first step that he took, and the first mistake he made, was this. He tried to dodge the decision. Have you ever tried to do that? Have you ever been faced with an unpleasant choice? Something that was being thrust upon you, some situation into which you were pressed, and you knew that you had to do something about it. You just couldn't stand aside there and be neutral. You had to make some kind of a decision. Well, now Pilate tried to dodge that decision. It was his official duty, of course. It came in the lines of his authority, but he didn't want to do it. He would take care of any other business in the empire. He would dispatch any other matters, but he just didn't want to have anything to do with this man, because of these strange new feelings and convictions that were stirring within his soul. So he just wanted to put Jesus aside there and let him be and dodge the decision. Now, friends, if you have ever been tempted to do that same thing, I want you to take note very carefully with me today what happened to Pilate when he tried to do this. And then make sure that you never try to do it again. Listen, when Jesus Christ knocks at the door of your heart and you try to get rid of him and dodge a decision that he's demanding that you make, friends, you'll never be the same again if you turn him away. You will not. We have to answer that knock at the door of our heart. Pilate stood there trying to think of some way that he could get out of this, and that he could dodge a decision, and suddenly it came to him. Why, somebody had said Jesus of Nazareth. And that meant really that this prisoner didn't even belong in his docket at all. He belonged over there in Herod's court. And so he called soldiers to his side, and he gave them orders, and they led the prisoner out the door and down the cobblestone street on the way out to that other court. And Pilate turned around, congratulating himself and feeling that he had made a very astute decision and that he had avoided a very unpleasant situation. But my friends, you can't get out of the decision that easily, can you? You can't do it. If you've tried it, you understand that when Jesus is standing there and you're asked to make a decision about him, you can't avoid it very easily. Because soon there were shouts out in the street and the door burst open again, and here they came, those soldiers bringing the prisoner again, and there he was standing once more in front of Pilate. You see, Herod wanted to just play games with Jesus. He wanted to see him work some miracles for him and do some tricks for him. And Jesus wouldn't do it. He didn't even respond to him. He wouldn't even answer him. And finally, in a petulant state of anger and even rage, Herod sent him away and ordered him back. And now the soldiers come bringing Jesus, the prisoner, and he's standing once more in front of Pilate. And now he stood there trembling and trying to think of some other alternative. What other option was open to him? He wanted to avoid this thing at any cost. What could he do? And then we find Pilate making his second terrible mistake in his downward course. He decided to lower the standard just a little bit and compromise just a little bit with his own convictions. And he made this announcement to the people. He said, look, I find no fault in him, and I want to let him go. But because of what you're doing and what you're saying, I will have him scourged, and then we will release him and let him go. Now, friends, I wonder, have you ever been tempted to do the same thing? To lower the standard just a little bit in your own life? To compromise the truth maybe just a little bit? To shade things over a little bit, to give not quite a full and accurate picture of the way things are? Well, if you have, listen to me as I tell you what happened to Pilate when he tried to do the very same thing. He said, all right, I'll compromise with you. I'll lower the standard. I don't believe he's guilty. I believe he's innocent, but nevertheless, I'll go along with you and we'll scourge this man. Then we'll let him go. You see, Pilate was really gambling this time. He felt that if those people could see the awful spectacle of a Roman scourging, their lust for blood would be satisfied. And they'd be glad to release this man who was so obviously innocent before them. And so he had Jesus brought and positioned there in front of that mob. Now, friends, I don't know whether you know anything at all about a Roman punishment or not, but I want to describe it for you. Maybe you don't even know about this kind of an open public scourging that took place so often in those Roman tribunals. I'll try to describe it. They brought the prisoner. He was stripped down to the waist. And then they called out the roughest and most brutal soldier in the Roman legions to administer the punishment. And the instrument of punishment was that long whip with leather thongs interlaced with bits of sharpened steel. And the soldier stood quite a distance away, and he brought that great whip or scourge around him with all of his strength, and it would wrap around the naked body of the prisoner, and the flesh would be lacerated, the blood would flow, and the suffering was excruciating. And Pilate stood there and watched as the blows came down upon the body of the innocent prisoner. And oh, friends, I can believe that his old tyrant heart was almost moved to tears as he saw the patient suffering of Jesus. You see, Christ didn't retaliate at all. There was no anger, no revenge. He stood there calmly with the peace of heaven written upon his face, benign, no show of anger, not even irritation. It almost seemed like the hatred of that crowd was rolling up there and breaking at his feet like a tide on the shore. It didn't touch him. It didn't affect him. There was no reaction, apparently, on the part of the prisoner. And Pilate took note of all that. And then after it was all finished, he turned to the crowd and he said, all right, now we will let him go. He suffered enough. This is it. I find no fault in him. We'll turn him loose. But then, friends, there came a great roar back from that crowd. Oh, no, they were not willing to do that. And they cried out the more for him not to be released. And then somebody out there in that crowd must have said something that made a tremendous impression upon Pilate. It seems from what we have in the Scriptures that somebody out there must have said, listen, you've declared this man innocent, and yet you've punished him and scourged him publicly here. We will report you to Rome for this. And then Pilate realized that he had made a terrible mistake indeed. He had violated one of the very basic tenets of Roman law. He had declared the man innocent, and yet he had ordered him to be punished. And now this was going to be reported to Rome. His position would be in danger. His job might be taken away from him. And so Pilate made his third mistake, friends, on his downward course. He decided that no matter what it would cost him, no matter what would be involved, he would have to hold on to his position, hold on to his job, no matter what it cost him. And I tell you today that was one of the very worst mistakes he made. Listen, you can violate your conscience by trying to hold on to your position, can't you? You surely can. There are a lot of things more important than your job or your friends or even your family. We have to put God first in our lives, friends. And let's not ever make the mistake that Pilate made that day in deciding that he would have to keep his job and maintain his status and his position there in society, in government, in his work. Oh, that's not nearly as important as being true to our own conscience and to follow what God reveals to us. But Pilate made that mistake, and now he stood there trembling, pale, perspiration on his face, and trying to probe in his mind for some other alternative, some other way of escape from this dilemma in which he found himself. And then suddenly it came to him like a flash of unholy inspiration. Why, of course, this was the time, this was the season when any prisoner could be released, whomever the people might require and request. And so he called a soldier to his side. And he sent that soldier hurrying back through those maximum security doors of the inner prison, where Barabbas was languishing. That violent, evil man who had rampaged over the countryside, attacking people, killing people. And they feared this man. Oh, he had become a terror to the community. And everyone locked their doors and bolted their doors and feared the very name of Barabbas. And now, here they brought Barabbas out of that prison, and Pilate had him positioned there right beside Jesus. And the two men were there together. Pilate, his face contorted with evil, the beady eyes of a professional criminal looking out with malignity upon those people. And then there was Jesus standing there with a very radiance and peace of God on his face, a holy beauty and a holy innocence shining forth as he stood looking kindly and benignly upon those people. What a contrast. And of course, this is what Pilate wanted. This was another one of his plans and his ploys, that perhaps he could escape by having these two men there. He could see himself the obvious contrast. He wanted that crowd to see the contrast too. And he wanted them to understand what it would mean if this criminal was released again, and how he'd be once again attacking and destroying the people as he went around on his crime activities. And so the two men stood there. Pilate must have given plenty of time so that they could fully see and comprehend exactly what was before them. The two men and their natures. Then he asked his question. You remember, of course, what the question was. And he did it with great deliberation, no question about it. And this man was a man of authority. I think Pilate spoke with a lot of power and authority. He was accustomed to ruling men and dealing with men and ordering armies and so forth. And he could stand before a crowd and make a great impression. And he must have stood there then and quite confidently asked that question, which he anticipated, of course, the answer, but which brought back the wrong response. He said, "Whom will ye that I release unto you?" And perhaps for just a fraction of a moment, it may have seemed that his gamble had paid off. Maybe there was just a moment of silence. But then there came back that surprising cry from that crowd, and they said, "Release unto us Barabbas." You see, Pilate could not believe his ears. He must have stood there, confused and confounded, and asked the question again. And once more the same answer came by. And then, I suppose in a voice that was quite querulous with fear, he said, "What then will ye do with Jesus, which is called the Christ?" And then came that great roaring response from that crowd. And I'll tell you something, my friends, demons were out there in human form that day, weren't they? Speaking out of human voices. And they said, "Crucify him, crucify him." And Pilate just could not believe it, friends. And he stood there, no doubt, quaking and trembling, and realizing that his very last avenue of escape seemed to be closing up before him. Now listen, what was he doing? He was taking his fourth step of self-destruction. That's what he was doing. You see, friends, he believed that he could remain neutral in this thing. Can you be neutral when it comes to the claims of Jesus Christ, friends? Can you? You can't do it. Have you ever tried to do it? Maybe you've tried to do the very same thing that Pilate was doing that day. Have you felt that you didn't want to really get involved? Oh, you were a Christian, all right, but you just didn't want to let everybody know about it. You didn't want to talk about it. Pilate, I don't believe Pilate wanted anything to do with destroying Jesus. I think he wanted to release Jesus. He wasn't trying to kill him. He was trying to help him. But in doing so, he was afraid to take a stand. And so he just stood off there and tried to be neutral. Oh, the Bible says, "He that is not for me is against me." That's what God says. My friends, you can't be neutral. You've got to take a position. You've got to either crown him or crucify him. You've got to accept him or reject him. Which is it with you? Which will it be with you today, friends? Will you crown him or crucify him? Are you afraid to acknowledge him? Are you ashamed to acknowledge him? Don't be. Don't be. Boldly make your decision and step out to follow Jesus.